I'm gonna make some people really upset today because I'm painting doll parts with this. Hey everybody, this is Lomi, and if your time in the hobby has been anything like mine, you've probably heard 1,000 times that you should never use spray paint on a doll, and worse than that, you should never let anything oily come in contact with your dolls because it will cause damage. So you might be thinking, what in the world would possess me to use oil-based enamel spray paint on a BJD when oil-based products are called dangerous, spray paint is called dangerous, and enamel paints are called dangerous? First off, we have to establish that any material can be used on a doll. Some of them will cause damage, and some will only cause damage if they're used incorrectly. Because we have some paints, like Mr. Super Clear, which is renowned in the hobby as being the best sealant. But Mr. Super Clear is a lacquer-based spray paint, which is two things that you're not supposed to use on dolls. So what gives? This subject gets discussed a lot in other hobbies and not so much for BJDs, so it seemed like it was time for it to come up. When mixing paints like oils and acrylics or lacquer and enamel, there's a certain order they have to be used in. The order has to do with how the paint cures. Some paints have more effective solvents than others or take longer to dry, so they have to be applied in a certain order. Enamel paint has to go first, followed by lacquer, and then acrylics go on top. That means if you're using an enamel paint and you're using primer, you have to make sure that your primer is also enamel. But we also just established that Mr. Super Clear is a lacquer, so why do we put it on top of acrylics? Not only is Mr. Super Clear an acrylic lacquer, we also have solvent-based acrylic paints, like Tamiya acrylics, which can actually eat through lacquer sealants like Mr. Super Clear. A lot of determining what paints are safe to use in what order is trial and error. The primary problem you're looking for is etching, which I'll discuss a little bit later on. Right now we're going to focus on oil, and by the way, did you know that everybody's favorite face-up remover, Winsor & Newton Brush Cleaner and Restore, contains oils? And even though I spray painted Rune's parts with an oil-based auto primer almost 10 years ago, nothing bad has ever happened to those parts. By no means am I telling anybody to run out and use oil-based materials on your dolls right now, because it's really important to understand what they do, and that's what I'm going to be discussing today. So I'll walk you through the customization process I did for Rhyllyn's parts and tell you a little bit about how I reached my conclusion. First off, when I'm painting Rhyllyn's parts, I've put them on a dowel rod, secured them with a little bit of eye putty, and I'm just applying the paint directly to bare resin, no sealant or anything underneath it. The spray paint I'm using is formulated to be used on plastics, and that's really important when doing something like this. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the primary problem you're going to be looking for is etching, where the surface of the resin becomes kind of bumpy, ridged, or pitted. Etching happens when either the propellant or the solvent in a spray paint is too hot for the plastic to handle. It's actually dissolving the plastics, or resin in this case, just a little bit and causing that uneven surface. But it's also important to know that spray paint often goes on with a little bit of texture, and you have to build up several layers before it smooths out. So if the paint goes on, you really have to have familiarity with etching to know if the paint you're using is causing damage. This is why a lot of people practice airbrushing with enamels and lacquers on plastic spoons, because that plastic is very sensitive, and if it starts to etch when you spray the paint on it, it's a good indicator that it could potentially damage other plastics or resins. You can see that the first layer of paint I got on Rhyllyn's arms ended up having kind of an orange peel texture, but that evened out after I put on a few more coats. Part of why that happens is because spray paint has a much larger spray pattern than an airbrush does, so the droplets of paint themselves are bigger, and the only way to get a smooth coat is to either do several light coats or one really heavy one that ends up being harder to dry. As an aside along the way, I used my Silhouette Cameo 3 to make a stencil using vinyl that I'm going to apply to Rhyllyn's parts to make the scale texture that I want. I'm going to have the stencil file up on my website, so if you want to do scales at some point, you can just download it. Just be warned that it took like 5 hours to cut that thing. The hunter green paint that I chose actually matches pretty well with Rhyllyn's dyed feet. I'm excited about that because once I have the scale color on top, the color difference won't show. So, one of the things that made me start questioning everything I'd heard about oil-based materials on BJDs was when I stumbled across a post by a very well-respected doll maker talking about sanding tan resin, and her recommendation was to use baby oil while sanding to reduce the discoloration. Why in the world would a really well-respected doll creator recommend using oil on a BJD if it could damage your doll? After that, I spent a lot of time reading about the interactions between oil-based materials and resin, and it turned out that outside the BJD hobby, nobody really talked about it. In fact, in a lot of woodworking hobbies, people were using oils and resins together all the time with no adverse effects. So, right away I knew I was going to have to dig a little bit deeper to find out what the root of the problem is, and why we don't usually use oil-based materials on BJDs. The problem is actually the sealant. That's not to say that oil is completely harmless to resin. Resin is really porous, and the oil tends to sink in. That means that oil-based materials are much more likely to stain. That's why we don't use human-based eyeshadows or other makeup on BJDs in place of pastels for face-ups. They're a lot more prone to staining, and they also cause problems with the sealant. Even though oil is really slow drying, it does eventually dry out, which is why we have makeup that gets crumbly after it gets old, and oil paint does eventually stop being sticky. Stickiness is one thing that people often mistake for a problem with spray paint too, so I think a lot of these problems sort of go hand in hand. Even though I'm comfortable using enamels and lacquers and oil-based paints on my dolls, I do know that the oil-based ones take a lot longer to dry. In fact, after I sprayed Rhyllyn's parts, it took about 3 days for the enamel to fully cure. Prior to that, the paint was still sticky, and I think a lot of people could easily mistake that for a bad interaction between the resin and the paint, and end up stripping it back off. There are instances where prolonged exposure to oils can cause problems with resin, such as causing the resin to get soft. This is the problem you encounter when using an oil-based eye putty, which I talked about in my video about eyes. The good news is, once the oil is removed, the resin will harden up again. And in fact, in other hobbies, people often use oils to treat resin and vinyl to keep them from growing brittle. The biggest catch we run into is that oils can slowly cause sealants to break down. That means if you're using oil-based paints, or makeup, or something like that, it's eventually going to eat through your sealant down to the resin, and that's why it's much more prone to staining. The reason this isn't a problem with this oil-based spray paint that I'm using is that I've allowed it to fully cure, so it's completely dry. When you're doing a face-up or painting, usually you're applying the layers one after another very quickly, and that means oils end up trapped between the layers of sealant, and it ends up softening it over time. The amount of staining that you'll get will depend on what colors you're using, and also the type of oil-based material you're using. Like I mentioned before, I used oil-based primer on Rune's parts, and they haven't stained. The gray primer is incredibly difficult to remove, which is exactly why I like it. It has really superior adherence, but it takes a whole lot of scrubbing to get it off. So oil-based materials are great for longevity, but not so great for customizations that you want to redo later on. Staining's not a concern for parts that I was going to dye green anyway. Unfortunately, not every material is going to play nice with others, so testing is really important. Over my time in the hobby, I've had a lot of opportunities to use materials that other people don't touch so much, and a lot of my experimentation has happened on pieces of junk resin that I've cast myself. So I've kind of learned along the way what works really well for my dolls and the types of resin that I have in my household. But even for materials that are regarded as safe, you always want to test them on something that's not really going to be seen. So if you decide to spray paint a doll, test it on the head cap first, or an extra hand, or something you won't miss if it ends up being damaged. If you do decide to experiment, make sure you're using everything according to the manufacturer's directions. Make sure you understand how to layer your paints to make sure they cure properly. And be prepared for things to not go as well as you want. You may end up sanding things back off of dolls if it doesn't turn out right. A lot of the things that people say are safe in the hobby are regarded as safe because they're generally hard to misuse. For example, I've never had problems using acetone on my dolls, but there are some people that have had issues, mostly based on the type of resin that their doll is. Since every BJD company could possibly be using a different type of resin, testing is always going to be important, even for safe materials such as watercolors and acrylics, because they're going to stain worse on some resins and could potentially damage some resins. Just like how even though Tamiya acrylics are safe for face-ups, they're not good to apply over the top of Mr. Super Clear because they're alcohol-based and that will eat right through the sealant. I've devoted a lot of my time on YouTube to using materials that I don't see used very frequently, and that's why you see things like the Martha Stewart craft acrylics that I'm using on Rhyllyn's legs. They're not something you would typically see used for BJDs because most customizers prefer higher grade artist paints, but one of the reasons I like these is they're actually made to stay put on glass, so they're much more durable after they've had a proper curing time. Likewise, these stencils were a big experiment and I wasn't really sure how they were going to turn out. I'd never applied vinyl to any of my dolls before, but I'm really happy with how this worked. Some of my seams didn't align perfectly, and there were some places where the paint seeped or smudged under the stencil, but on the whole I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And on the arms you can see one of the benefits of using the really durable enamel paint is that I can peel the stencil back off without having to worry about the paint underneath coming up, which might be a problem with acrylics, especially if you're not using a primer. So what can we really take away from all this in the end, aside from the fact that I'm a little bit more adventurous with my dolls than some people would probably be comfortable with? Well, it's that everything you hear, you should ask to hear sources or a more thorough explanation of why you're not supposed to use a material or what a certain material can do if used improperly. So am I telling you that it's safe to go use whatever you want on your dolls? No, you should not. You should definitely take the time to experiment though, and make sure you're testing everything thoroughly and properly. You might find some materials that you really love that you didn't know you could use. I am saying though that you should take everything you're told with a grain of salt, including this, because what works for my dolls might not work for yours. The important thing is just keeping an open mind and knowing that the way you've always been told might not actually be the truth. I think if I had known that enamels were okay to use if used correctly, I would have been using a lot of different materials in my customization projects much earlier on. I wouldn't have been as timid about really digging in and exploring what I could do with unusual materials that I don't see. And most importantly, I think as a new hobbyist, I wouldn't have been as terrified to touch my dolls' faces if I had known that a little bit of oil on my fingertips wasn't going to destroy them. I mean, seriously, this is stuff that I was told when I was new. Some people will always be more comfortable washing their hands before they handle their dolls, but I'm not one of those people. I like doing things that are bold and adventurous in the hobby, and maybe even a little bit reckless. It's not for everyone, but it's what works for me. I've seen some people in the GK hobby that straight up paint their models with oil paints out of a tube, and while I probably wouldn't go that far with my BJDs, I'm not too worried about using spray paint for heavy body blushing or for color changes on dolls that aren't in the right shade. While these paints that I'm using on Rhyllyn will eventually chip off because all paint does eventually, I think it has a much better chance of durability, especially considering the oil did help the paint sink into the resin and really adhere. But I guess we'll know for sure once he's all put back together. That's all for today though. Thanks for joining me again. Bye.